welcome to today's webinar addressing Scope 3 emissions to achieve science-based targets. This webinar is being held in partnership between UN Global Compact Network UK and the Science Based Targets Initiative. Thank you all for joining us today. So just a quick housekeeping before we get going. This is a 1-hour webinar. It's being recorded and the recording will be sent to you afterwards in an email. We will have some time later on for questions. So if you do have any questions, I just ask you to use the Q&A box rather than the chat function. That just helps me to keep track of what's coming in. So my name is Amy Collins and I lead the Climate Action Programme here at the UN Global Compact Network UK. And I'm delighted to be joined today by a great group of speakers. So we have Rowan Adams, who's the Executive Vice President Corporate Affairs, and Anna Pearce, Director of Sustainability, both joining us today from Tate Lyles. Rowan and Anna have kindly agreed to share their experience of how they've been addressing Scope 3 emissions at Tate Lyles. So looking forward to hearing all about that in a bit. I'm also joined by Chandan Yan, who's Associate at the World Resources Institute and who is also part of the Science Based Targets Initiative, the core team. So I'll hand over to Chandan in just a moment to introduce the SBTi and talk about how Scope 3 emissions fits into science-based targets. But just before that, I briefly would like to introduce the UN Global Compact for those of you who are not familiar with us. So the UN Global Compact is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. We have over 12,000 businesses and 3,000 non-businesses participating today. And it was launched 20 years ago to establish universal values among businesses around the world. So we ask companies to align their operations and their strategies with 10 universally accepted principles in the areas of human rights, labour, environment and anti-corruption. And that just provides us with a solid foundation to work with business, government and civil society to create a more responsible and sustainable world. The UN Global Compact is also one of the founding partners in the SBTi, along with WRI, CDP and WWF. I know that's quite a lot of acronyms, but I'm sure you all know who they are. But Chandan will have more to say about that in just a moment. Today, the UN Global Compact has networks in around 68 countries who help to support businesses at the local level as well as at the global level. Here in the UK, we carry out a range of work and activities to support the 10 principles, and specifically we have programs dedicated to the UN SDGs, business and human rights, and climate action. So if this is new to you, I just encourage you to get in touch with us or check out our website. So one of the key areas of work in the UK network is on science-based targets. Some of you may have joined our series earlier this year that provided an introduction to setting science-based targets, specifically within different sectors. So we had a few webinars for finance, construction, retail and manufacturing, IT, energy, and professional services. And then coming out of those webinars, we identified some common challenges that companies face and struggle with. And clearly, there are a number of hurdles that companies have to overcome to commit and to set science-based targets. But the ones we identified as key were Scope 3 emissions and also gaining internal buy-in. So one of the first steps to setting a science-based target is to get the buy-in internally from all relevant actors. So from sustainability teams up to the C-suite. So our first webinar in October focused on this and explored the business case, and we looked at how to build internal support and navigate potential pushbacks. And then today's webinar, we will of course be looking at Scope 3 emissions, which you're probably all aware can be one of the most challenging areas to address because largely they are out of a company's control as they sit within the value chain. However, as we'll go on to explain, they are extremely important to address because many companies, they can make up the majority of their total emissions. And of course, if you're looking to set a science-based target, they will likely be part of the criteria you have to meet. So in today's webinar, we'll just cover some of the basics of setting science-based targets, and we will provide an overview of the SBTi Scope 3 emissions requirements and how you can begin to identify Scope 3 categories. We will explore some of the common challenges that companies face when it comes to addressing Scope 3 emissions and look to how to overcome these. And then we will, of course, hopefully provide you with a few practical tips that you can take away. So I would like to hand over to Chandan now, who is going to tell us more and get into the important information.
Great. Thanks, Amy, for the introduction. So hello, everyone. My name is Chandan Yan, and I am an associate at the World Resources Institute based in Washington, D.C. So I sit on the target validation team on the Science-Based Targets Initiative and also on the technical team. So that means I validate companies' target submissions, and I also worked on developing sector guidance for apparel and footwear companies and financial institutions. So both sectors have significant Scope 3 emissions. So yeah, I'll just start with a brief introduction to SBTi, and I think many of you are aware of what we do. So as Amy mentioned, we are a collaboration between 4 organizations, so CDP, UN Global Compact, World Resources Institute, and WWF. So all the 4 organizations work collaboratively on the different teams on SBTi. So for instance, there are members from CDP, WRI, and WWF on the target validation team, just to give you more idea of how we work together. And our mission is really for science-based target setting to become a standard business practice in the future, which means that when a company is looking to set a target, they will automatically look to setting science-based targets. Next slide, please. So we have a 3-pillar strategy to achieve our mission, and we develop methods and tools that are free and open source for companies to use and develop their own targets. And we created target setting resources to help companies understand how they can start their target setting journey. And we also have this mission to create a critical mass of companies. And with that, we provide a validation service and a call to action platform that companies can join to take action. So so far we have over 1,000 companies formally joining us, and 526 companies with already approved targets. So you can find these numbers on our website, and we recently launched a new website that's looking great. And so you can find all of the approved and committed companies on our website under the companies taking action page. So we are calling on companies to join us through this call to action 5-step process. So that is to sign a letter and formally commit to us. That means the company will have 2 years to have their targets approved by us from the date that the commitment letter is signed. And then the company will go on to develop their targets, submit their targets for us for an official validation. And once the targets are approved, communicate, announce their targets, and disclose their target progress and GHG inventory on an annual basis, which is a requirement of setting science-based targets. So next I'll go on to go through our Scope 3 criteria. So Scope 3 target setting is a very integral part of science-based targets. And one reason is that value chain emissions of companies are pretty significant. And there's a data point here that 100 companies, the value chain emissions of 100 companies account for up to 66% of global GHG emissions. So this is really to say that a company's value chain emissions is not something to neglect over. So just a quick recap on the 3 different emission scopes. Scope 1 emissions are the direct GHG emissions. Scope 2 emissions are electricity purchased by the company. And Scope 3 emissions are all the other indirect GHG emissions that are a consequence of the activities of the company, but don't occur from sources that are owned or controlled by the company itself. And there are 15 Scope 3 categories that are defined in the GHGP Scope 3 standard. So here on this page, you can see the main Scope 3 criteria. So first of all, a Scope 3 emission screening is required for companies to understand how significant their Scope 3 emissions are. And if these emissions are more than 40% of a company's total Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, then a target is required. So in terms of to what extent these targets should cover a company's Scope 3 emissions, this is what the boundary criteria address, is that targets must cover at least 2/3 of a company's Scope 3 emissions. So this 2/3 boundary is really to enable companies to focus on the most significant sources in their Scope 3 emissions while still leaving some flexibility for other categories that might be insignificant and might be challenging for companies to address. So the timeline of Scope 3 targets is the same as for Scope 1 and 2 target, which is 5 to 15 years looking to the future. However, there's a different timeframe requirement for supplier or customer engagement targets, which I'll talk about later. And so there are different ambition options for companies to choose from for Scope 3 emissions targets. So the ambition requirement for Scope 3 is slightly more flexible than that for Scope 1 and 2, just because we understand that Scope 3 emissions can be challenging to address. And so the first option is an absolute reduction target that's consistent with keeping temperature increase below 2 degrees. So you might be aware that the minimum ambition level for Scope 1 and 2 for science-based targets is actually well below 2C, so that's around 1.7 degree. So that's more ambitious than the minimum level that we require for Scope 3 absolute targets. And the second option is intensity targets that are in line with keeping temperature increase below 2C. And so that includes targets that are modeled in line with the sectorial decarbonization approach for several of homogeneous sectors, or an economic intensity reduction approach under the GIVA method. Or the third option is for other emission reduction targets that do not result in absolute emissions growth, however, at the same time lead to a 2% annual linear physical intensity reduction. And so an alternative approach to setting these Scope 3 emissions reduction targets is to set engagement targets for a company's value chain partners, so their suppliers or customers. So there are also 4 criteria related to these engagement targets. So first of all, the formulation, the company has to provide information on what percentage of emissions from the relevant upstream or downstream categories that are covered by these engagement targets. So if the emissions information is not available, the company can provide a percentage spend information. So we understand that to what extent these targets cover a company's Scope 3 emissions. So the boundary for these targets are that they should cover relevant downstream or upstream categories. So a common example of an upstream category would be purchased goods and services, where companies engage their material suppliers for their suppliers to set their own SBTs. So the timeline of these engagement targets are more aggressive. So that is, these targets should be set within 5 years from the date that this engagement target is submitted to SBTi. The 5-year timeline is really for faster action for suppliers to start addressing their own emissions. And the ambition for these targets are that at least they should be set on this, the supplier's scope 1 and 2 emissions. And we encourage scope 3 emissions of suppliers to be included as well. So next, I'll just talk through some common challenges that companies face when they set targets or for scope 3 emissions or are trying to achieve their scope 3 targets. So the first step to managing scope 3 emissions is really to quantify these emissions. And many companies ask the question of, what resources or what tool is available for us to have this initial screening. So we do have a free scope 3 evaluator that helps company conduct a high-level economic emissions factor-based screening of their scope 3 emissions, so they get an overall high-level idea of where most of their scope 3 emissions lie in the inventory. So based on a screening, companies can already draw the 67 boundary around where the targets are set. So SBTi does accept a screening of scope 3 emissions as a first step to setting targets. But over time, we recommend that companies use this iterative approach to improve the accuracy of their scope 3 inventory and to better track their target progress over time. So on here, you can see that this is the iterative approach that is included in the scope 3 standard from a spend-based approach, which is what is used in the scope 3 evaluator, to over time using average emissions data for physical intensity emission factors, to a hybrid approach, meaning that the companies might be using a screening approach or spend-based approach for some of the categories, while a more detailed approach for others. And over time, the ultimate goal is to collect more supplier-specific data. So a good example is from IKEA. They recently launched an aggressive circular economy initiative. And so we had an interview with them to understand how they're making progress on their goal. So they have built a simulation tool internally to evaluate the outcome of their circular economy actions. So at the time of the interview, they said that it was still unclear for them how their circular economy initiatives are helping them achieve emissions reductions, but they are looking to collect more primary data. And as more primary data is collected, they can better understand the feasibility of different material substitutions and how to better capture the emissions reduction of its circular economy initiatives. So this example is included in our value chain report that you can also find on our website. So another common challenge when it comes to target setting is to identify which target setting method is most applicable for a company. So as I mentioned, we do have these 3 options, and in general, I think companies that are looking to achieve more aggressive reductions set absolute targets, and that's also the most direct link to reducing emissions. Because the target is in absolute terms, the company is committed to achieve these reductions in absolute terms, whereas compared to other intensity target setting methods, it can be unclear whether the actual emissions reductions will be achieved. But these intensity options do allow more flexibility for companies, especially ones that are looking to grow very aggressively into the future. So on the right side, you can see some of the examples of approved targets under each option. And lastly, just want to talk about an example of a company that set supplier engagement targets and how that has enabled this company to unlock more opportunities for collaborations with its value chain partners, or even its peers. So HPE launched a comprehensive supply chain management program in 2017, and they have a supplier engagement target for by 2025 that 80% of its manufacturing spend will go to suppliers with SBTs. So to achieve that goal, they have tied their social and environmental responsibility scorecard, so the SER scorecard, to their so the suppliers' SER performance directly into their procurement decisions. That means they've added two requirements for suppliers. The first one is for the suppliers to commit to SBTs and have a third-party verification on their inventory. But HPE doesn't just require their suppliers to achieve these actions. They're also actively supporting their suppliers to set their own SBTs through developing specific tools and guidance to help suppliers set and reach SBTs. And they provide also online courses and one-on-one consulting for their suppliers. And in addition, HPE is also just going above and beyond and asking and challenging their peers or their competitors in the sector to collectively ask their shared suppliers to set SBTs, because a group of customers requesting a supplier to complete a certain action is way more impactful than a single company having the same ask. So yeah, with that, I will turn over to Rowan to talk through some examples. Yep.
Thank you, Chendan. Thank you, and hope you can all hear me. Welcome, everyone. It's really good to be here with you. As Amy said earlier, my name is Rowan Adams. I'm the head of external relations at Tate Lyles. I sit on our executive committee. Joining me today, and you'll hear from in a minute, is our director of sustainability, Anna Pierce. She's based out of New Jersey in the US, so thank you, Anna, for joining us early at the start of your week. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a very brief background about Tate Lyles, our sustainability journey, before I hand over to Anna, who's the real expert on Scope 3, and she will talk to you about some of the projects that we're practically using to measure our Scope 3 emissions. And of course, we're happy to take questions after that. Maybe just before I start, maybe I should just say that Tate Lyles, of course, is a FTSE 250 company. We're a food ingredients business. We're about 160 years old, and we have about £3 billion worth of sales every year. Just to be absolutely clear, we don't make or sell sugar. We used to, but we sold our last sugar business, including our UK sugar business, over 10 years ago in 2010. These days, we are a pure B2B business. We develop solutions that actually, maybe ironically, takes sugar out of products, also fat and calories, and we add back in nutritional ingredients such as fiber and protein. Importantly, for our Scope 3 targets, most of our products, if not all our products, are made from plants or from agricultural products. So mostly from corn, but also from products like raw materials such as tapioca, stevia, leaves, maybe monk fruit, and also potatoes. We operate out of about 30 countries around the world, but most of our business is in America and also increasingly in Southeast Asia. As you can see on the screen and the slide, we're very much a purpose-driven company. We have been around for 160 years, and although purpose is relatively new to many companies, for us it's been a foundation of our company for all that time. We have three pillars of our purpose for improving lives for generations, and I won't go through them in detail, but you'll see the one on the right is the really relevant one for this discussion. Caring for our planet, or sustainability, is key to everything we do in Tate Lyles. Next slide, please. That said, back in 2019, around the middle of 2019, our management team, our leadership team, we kind of all sat down together. And I suppose we took a long, hard look in the mirror and said to ourselves, are we doing enough on sustainability? Are we doing what we feel we should be doing? And the sort of resounding answer was, well, no. We had reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 20% over the previous 8 years. We'd made good progress in one or two areas, but we all agreed collectively we needed to do a lot more and to integrate sustainability into everything we do in the business. So we took a number of actions to make that happen. The first one was we developed and published back in May this year a set of new targets for sustainability, and I'll come on to those in a minute. We also committed that our greenhouse gas emissions targets would be validated by the Science Based Initiative, and we're delighted that in September we got that confirmation. We joined the UN Global Compact, so we're a relatively new member of the organization, and we started to identify which one of the SDGs we would like to prioritize. And again, I'll come on to that in a second. As I said, we started to think about how can we integrate sustainability within everything we do in the company. And just one example of that, we issued a revolving credit facility in the summer, and actually we linked the pricing of that facility to our new targets for water, waste, and greenhouse gas emissions. Like I'm sure many people on the call here today, we started to work towards disclosing on the TCFDs, and we'll be doing that in our next annual report. And most importantly for this discussion, we really took a good hard look at our value chain, at all our suppliers, at our customers, and we started to build partnerships, or how could we build partnerships to address the thorny issue of Scope 3 delivery. Next slide, please. So as I said before, we put at the same time as developing our 2030 sort of environmental targets, we also had an internal team looking at some of the things that we would like to do to really align our purpose with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We chose 5 in total that we felt were closely aligned to our purpose, and we started to set targets against each of those. I put some of them on the screen here. I'm not going to go through them in detail. But for example, gender equality is incredibly important to Tate Lyles. We've got a target that all our leadership roles will have gender parity, so 50% men, 50% women by 2025. At the moment, we're at about 28%, so we have a little way to go. That's our sort of top 70 roles, not just our executive committee. Next slide, please. So I said in May, early this year, we launched a number of sustainability targets and commitments. You can see these on the screen, and they really covered the suite of areas we felt that we had most impact. Scope 1 and 2 emissions, Scope 3 emissions, also waste and water. And we also made some commitments around agriculture, which is obviously incredibly important to us, as all our products are made from agricultural products or plants. And we also took another big decision for the company. We decided that we wanted to eliminate coal from all our operations by 2025. That was quite a big decision, as we have some very large corn processing plants in the Midwest of the US, and a number of those are coal-fired. And so we've put in place a $150 million capital project, which is underway now, and will eradicate coal from all our sites by, we think, a little bit before 2025. I suppose the one target that we set was a bit of a leap of faith was actually the Scope 3 emissions, because as Amy said earlier, it's something that's out of your control. And although we set a 15% target, we'd like to think we can do more than that over the next 10 years. But it is a complex issue, and we're very lucky to have Anna Pierce as our head of sustainability, because she had already started to work on some projects which would help us with our Scope 3, and is, I shall embarrass her by saying, an expert in this area. So that hopefully gives you a bit of context for our journey and where we've got to. So I'm going to hand over to Anna now, who's going to talk in more detail about our Scope 3 journey. Anna.
Thanks, Rowan. Okay, so Scope 3, it's big, and it can be a little scary, and it can be this really gray area because you don't have any control over it. So it's all about partnership and influence. So we started with the initial screening. Being an agriculture-based business, I don't think anyone was surprised that more than 2/3 of our emissions were Scope 3, particularly in corn. It's a very intense process on the environment to grow, and that's all part of our Scope 3 emissions. So when we really took the next step in part of that screening to break it down, a very large portion was our purchased goods and services, again, pointing back to corn. The other portion that was significant is the use of our products by our customers as they formulate and finalize products that go directly to consumers. And that's an area that really takes working with our customers to understand how we can better share information. So that category for us is something that we're going to continue to focus on individual key customers and how can we provide them with better information and more transparency into our emissions, as well as them sharing that same information with us. Because unlike scope 1 and 2, scope 3 really does depend on those customer and consumer relationships to gather that data and really start to talk about the difference that we're all making together, because we all have a similar goal. We're all trying to reduce our emissions and focusing on reducing emissions in our value chain. So all of that led us to a science-based target of a 15% absolute reduction by 2030. And then the work began. So if we start to the next slide, we focused on purchased goods and services. That was the first step. It's our largest agricultural raw material by far. So if we're going to be serious about making an impact on the environment, whether it's a science-based target or not, you have to start with your most significant source of emissions. And for that, for us, was corn. So in 2018, we launched a partnership with Trueterra. It's the conservation business within Land O'Lakes. Land O'Lakes is one of the largest grower-owned cooperatives in the United States. We expanded that pilot in 2019 to cover a full 1.5 million acres. And that's equivalent to Tate Lyles' global annual corn procurement volume. So for us, we wanted to make sure that we had a universal solution. We had really high data quality so that we could track the progress, so that our customers could opt into the program and track their progress. And we wanted to have a program that enabled our global customers to have a global solution. So by opting in 100%, it lets our customers in Europe who may be buying products from our European plant realize those sustainability targets and progress towards those targets through this program. So that's a bit of the reasoning behind why we partnered on one solution for all of our global corn procurement. It is to date the largest agricultural sustainability program in the United States. It's registered with Field to Market in the US that sets the standard for commodities, and we're an active member of Field to Market. And the program engages over 2,000 growers. So we're talking about not a boutique, one-off, sustainability-focused program. We're talking about a shift in the industry and really working at scale to drive change and to learn what works and what doesn't. So as I mentioned, our customers can opt into the program. They can partner with us at varying levels of engagement to not only get the data to demonstrate progress against their Scope 3 targets, but also help support the growers in their own sustainability journeys and provide support to them as they're working to lessen their environmental footprint. So if we move on to the next slide, this program for us and for many of our customers is really seen as a best-in-class solution. So industry standard is that we collect 10% of the data and extrapolate the results to 90% of the agricultural processes. And that's a big leap from a data integrity and quality standpoint. Through Trueterra, we collect 100% of the data on the enrolled acres. So we have data on a full 1.5 million acres. It makes a phenomenal baseline. It really lets us over time analyze the data and understand where the trends are beyond just Scope 3 emissions. So there's a lot of value in capturing that data up front. The solution also provides the growers with access to run scenarios to understand, if I make this conservation change on my land, how will that affect my revenue? So if we're talking about implementing conservation practices, we want to make sure that it's sustainable for the grower financially. So they're able to weigh scenarios to find the right conservation practice on the field level at each of their farms to make those changes and to see a real return on investment. So they're not jumping in blindly, hoping that this conservation practice will not only have a positive impact on the environment, but will also enable them and their families to continue farming. So that's why that data is really important, not only for us and our customers, but also for the growers themselves. The data is audited, it's reported, it's integral to Scope 3 measurements and progress, so it has to be. It has to be robust, it has to have systems behind it, so that we're able to have those science-based targets and really demonstrate progress. Aside from greenhouse gas emissions, we track other tangible KPIs over the years. We pay a lot of attention to soil quality, a lot of attention to erosion. They are the foundation of regenerative agriculture. They're not the only metrics that we track, but they're important, particularly as our discussions all evolve to talk about carbon markets. This is one of the areas that we are learning as we go. And again, we have the data to be able to do that. So if we go to the next slide. This year, we were able to report our first year-over-year results on the acres that are enrolled. So we started out in that 2018 pilot with a little over 300,000 acres. We only talk about the results on the acres that were enrolled in the program both years. That's important to us because if you're really going to demonstrate change, if the acres weren't enrolled both years, that gets a little bit difficult to track. So our direct impact in that year on 148,000 acres was a significant increase in the adoption of conservation practices, again, because the growers had more support and more information to make those changes. We saw a nice 10% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We saw improvements in soil quality, again, pointing at the beginnings of laying the foundation for carbon sequestration. We all talk about regenerative agriculture and carbon markets as though they're ready-made boxes that we can track and opt into. But when you're partnering in that agricultural base, those conservation practices that the farmers adopted over that year are going to take 2 to 3 years to really see the benefit from. So it's something that we have to work now. So towards the end of the decade, we're able to realize those results. This isn't a relationship that happens overnight or improvements that we see over 1 year. So it's really important to continue to lay that foundation when your suppliers are agriculturally based. And then again, we saw a nice reduction in erosion, which also keeps the soil on farm, but also improves water quality around the farms and the communities where we live and work. So if we go to the next slide, a couple of things for us in terms of next step. So as discussed earlier, it's important to do the screening, but then it's important to really understand the categories and the sources of your Scope 3 emissions. So we're in the process now of building a really robust Scope 3 baseline. I will tell you that is not a 1 month exercise. We're on our 5th month. It's probably going to wrap up in the next month or so. I think it was partly slowed down to COVID, but when you're looking at measuring something for the next 10 years, you want to have a really strong foundation, because in 8 years, it's very difficult to go back and say, oh, what was our procurement volume and how did we transport things nearly a decade ago? No one will have those answers. So we're thinking about that. We're thinking about the categories where we're building programs that will be important to report on again in the future, so that we have all of that data and we can perform the analytics as our program develops. For us, it's really developing action plans around our key Scope 3 emission categories. So some of them aren't significant for us, but may be significant for us from a UN SDG standpoint or an employee engagement standpoint. So of course, we'll go ahead and do those. Others just aren't that impactful. And when we talk about caring for our planet and we talk about Scope 3 emission reductions, it's important to pull in our business partners, and in some cases, our customers and our suppliers to have those discussions about how can we really take emissions down. Albeit a little bit more challenging in agriculture, it's a conversation that needs to start. So that's where we're at now in terms of developing our next steps in shorter term action plans. We're obviously going to continue to support and scale sustainable agriculture. It's a long journey. It's definitely not an overnight win. The customer piece is significant, and customers have varying levels of interest. Some aren't there yet, but are watching our journey as they develop their own plans. Others are tracking it for data purposes and have opted in. And others are saying, how can I do more? How can I support the farmers? How can I get boots on the ground? And that's one of the areas that we're working with some of our customers on. I think for us, it's also keeping a pulse on SBTi's Scope 3 reduction criteria, making sure that as we set our targets, as we're reporting out progress, that we're reporting out progress in meaningful ways. But some of the categories of Scope 3 emissions don't necessarily lend themselves to an annual evaluation. So how do we demonstrate progress without pulling a full, robust baseline review every single year? So that's something that we're working through as well. In terms of peak tips, I've hit on some of them. I do think the robust baseline is important. I think once you jump over the SBTi hurdle and you have the screening completed and you have your targets, it is important within a relatively short period of time to really get that strong foundation. I think some companies wish they had it and the data's gone. You can't go back and get it. I think less is more. So developing a program, and it may just be one program, but a robust program that you can measure progress against, that you know is going to be impactful, is more important than developing 10 programs and doing all of them, to varying levels of completion or thoroughness. So for us, we're really focusing on making sure that we're working through a meaningful way to address change. Making sure that data is auditable and measurable is important for us. It's important for our customers. It's important to initiatives like SBTi that we commit to when we join. Frankly, it's just part of emissions reporting that should be part of our regular processes. And I think it's really looking at the relationships within the value chain. Depending on your industry, that may be easier or more difficult, but the ability to share our Scope 1 and 2 emissions with our customers and 3 through our agricultural initiatives is critical for them and their reporting of Scope 3 emissions, just like it is for us to understand the role that our products play in their Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Because again, that all comes back to us in Scope 3. So years where we could concentrate on what was in our fence line are gone. We really have to build relationships and have discussions with our customers and our suppliers on a different level, and really start to work with third parties that are key stakeholders to drive change. And if we go to the next slide, I think that's it for us today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anna and Rowan. That was excellent, very detailed. So thank you for sharing your journey so far with us. Very inspiring to hear about all the work you're doing. We have got so many questions that have come in. I don't think we're going to be able to get through all of them, but we'll try. Rowan, Anna, Chandan, if you see any that you would really like to answer, please do just chip in, but I'll try to get through some of them. Maybe just quickly, Chandan, there were quite a lot of questions asking about the Scope 3 evaluator tool. If you could perhaps share the link to that, I think that would be very useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can paste it in the chat. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. So Anna, Rowan, maybe if I come to you first. There's a question here. So did you have an external consultant to help you assess and set out your Scope 3 emissions targets? Do you think it's essential to have support?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, this is not something you should go at alone. I'll definitely say that. People that our consultants are living and breathing this. They're working with SBTi. They understand what's under development. They understand options that you may be limited by as much as you know or as much as your team knows. We worked with a consultant to set our science-based targets. We're working with the same consultant to build a more robust Scope 3 baseline. I did see a question pop up about how many people were involved in that process. for us, it's probably about 30 people, with heavy involvement from our procurement teams and our logistics teams on transportation. And frankly, that goes in line with our more significant emissions categories. So you can probably get a good sense of who from your organization you would have involved, depending on where your scope 3 emissions fall.
Thanks. So there's lots of questions here also about engaging with your suppliers. I know you spoke quite a lot around this, around building partnerships and your conservation practice. I suppose there is a challenge of working with suppliers and maybe smaller scale businesses in that they might have different priorities. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you do work with suppliers to reassure them that reducing emissions is a positive thing for them? Maybe what tips you have to motivate your key suppliers? Do you offer any funding, that kind of thing? So yeah, if you could just tell us a bit more, that'd be great.
Certainly. I think we're lucky, as challenging as the agricultural space is, farmers are really good environmental stewards for the most part. They're concerned about their soil quality more than anybody. The soil quality is equivalent to their yield and their revenue. So there's an inherent benefit there. But let's not kid ourselves. There's also growers that have used very similar practices for generations and are very hesitant to make changes. I think part of our partnership with Trueterra and why we chose them as a partner was because our philosophies were aligned, that we wanted the farmers to do the right thing for the environment, but we also wanted the farmers to be able to be profitable in the process. So we don't incentivize the growers. We work with Trueterra to help them understand their data and their information so they can make a more informed decision, versus incentivizing them for a couple years and then hoping when the incentive is over that they continue that practice. Those programs don't have, a significant amount of success. Usually it's a little over 50%. Part of Trueterra being one of the largest agricultural co-ops in the United States is that they're farmer owned. So there's an inherent level of trust with the growers as they're talking to the Trueterra team and that network. Because frankly, no farmer is going to look to me to provide them with guidance on their agricultural practices, knowing I don't have an agronomy background or any kind of significant farming background. So I think it's also looking at the skill set of your company. And if you don't have the skills to engage your suppliers in those areas, it's really picking a partner or partners to work with that are like-minded, but they do have the credibility and do have information to share and to really provide support, versus incentivizing growers to do what you want, right? Adopt this one agricultural practice. This is more open, that they're adopting what's most appropriate for them and their farm.
Thanks, Anna.
Mm-hmm.
So you said one of your next steps was to look more at some of the key scope 3 categories for you.
Yes.
But just wondering, how have you accessed some of the data for these categories yet? Do you know how you plan on reducing some of the emissions from the other scope 3 categories? So for example, transportation, business travel, etc.
Right. So for us, we're working on transportation now, actually. That's one of our final pieces of the puzzle, if you will. We're looking at intercompany transportation of our products. And we broke down our purchase goods and services and the transportation of them a little bit more granularly than we expected to. So we're going back and looking at that another round, which I think sometimes can happen when you have data. So we're not there yet on plans for transportation. Certainly something that we're going to have to address. It's certainly something that the transportation team has ideas about. So I'll say a lot of these teams are excited to participate in the conversation. They might not be thrilled about gathering the data for the conversation, but they are excited to share their ideas and thoughts about changes and improvements we can make. Travel's a bit easier, especially in COVID. All jokes aside, travel's a very small percent of our Scope 3 emissions. It's around 1%. We are talking about looking at travel when things pick back up, but until we're there, it seems premature to start to make changes there. It's just not a significant source of emissions today. So it's also making sure that the targets and the changes that you're driving in your organization match the times that we're in. So I think when we get back to traveling, we'll have a new discussion about that.
Thanks, Anna.
Mm-hmm.
Chandan, if I could come to you next, there are lots and lots of questions for you. I don't think we'll be able to get to them, but hopefully maybe we could follow up with some after this webinar. Just wondering if you'd be able to clarify a bit the Science-Based Targets Initiative criteria around the use of offsets. I think a lot of companies are trying to understand how to fit offsets into their emissions strategies. So it'd be great to know how it fits within setting science-based targets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so SBTi doesn't accept offsets as a way to achieve targets because the targets are really set on emissions within the company's value chain. So the reduction should occur within the value chain instead of somewhere else. And there are just problems or questions around the credibility and effectiveness of offsets. So that's just something that is outside of the scope and boundary of SBTs.
Thanks, Chandan. And also just maybe another clarification. So are there any specific requirements on Scope 3 in the business ambition for 1.5 degree campaign that's different to just setting science-based targets, either well below 2 degrees or 1.5? So
yeah, so I think under the 1.5 campaign, some companies commit to set 1.5C aligned Scope 3 targets. And so SBTi doesn't currently classify Scope 3 targets. So we do stamp Scope 1 and 2 targets as well below 2C or 1.5C aligned, but we don't do that formally for Scope 3 targets. However, if a company is committed to the 1.5C campaign and wants to set a Scope 3 1.5 aligned target, we just use the different temperature thresholds to assess if the Scope 3 target is also in line with the 1.5 pathway. So that is just 4.2 annual linear reduction. It's the same threshold for Scope 1 and 2 targets.
thanks. I'm just going to come to this top question that is in the Q&A box. If the Scope 3 emission is based on spend, but the carbon intensity of those activities or sources are not really correlated to carbon intensity emissions, what are the suggestions to set Scope 3 boundary and to develop inventory?
Yeah, I think Anna might be better positioned to answer this question really, but I think the screening based on, like economic factors is just the first step, and it's a really rough estimate for companies to understand overall, which categories are the most significant. And I think another important thing to consider is, where you can really have the most influence and levers, as Anna has mentioned. So yeah, I don't know if Anna, you want to comment more on that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think spend is good for that initial screening. It's a quicker process. but it does actually get down to the details of use and procurement volumes and, you know, just the logistics of where is our company procuring the item? How is it being transported to our facility? And then that outbound transportation piece, aside from intercompany transportation, you really have to pull the thread on each one of your more significant procured products and then piece that all together to build a really robust baseline, which sounds exhausting and takes an incredible amount of time. So that's, it's not a 1 month exercise. For us, our Scope 3 emissions are going to look at well over 90% of the products that we procure, from ingredients that go into our finished products to agricultural raw materials like corn, stevia, tapioca. It's going to include all of that. I think at the end of the day, you have to make sure that the data you're collecting meets your own internal threshold of, is this enough for a baseline? 10 years from now, are we going to think that this is enough for a baseline? Would I be happy if I stepped into my role and this was what I had to work with? And just making sure that that really represents your business from an overall perspective, and that you're not inherently focusing on one product or one sector, maybe just because you have better information. So that process it takes a good amount of time.
Thanks, Bo. So we're nearly at the end of our time. I'm just wondering if I could ask you both for maybe one key piece of advice, or, you know, point people to a good resource or something like that. Yeah, just one final piece of advice from both Tate and Lyle and the SBTi. Anna, do you want to go first?
Sure. I really think it's about finding the right partners that match your philosophy. If you get far down the road and you don't have that, you end up starting over or trying to cobble things together to make that work. So I do think that that's a critical aspect of setting up programs and initiatives based on the foundation of the baseline that you built. I think the other piece is finding a consultant that you work well with and you trust. It's a really complicated topic. And I think having external experts that you can lean on is critical to setting targets that we all can actually achieve.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, Anna. So I've been trying to answer a few questions on the Q&A while you've been talking. Hopefully not that many as I'd like to, but I agree with that. And the final thing I would add is, you know, you need to get a lot of internal buy-in to do this, because you do have to involve a lot of people across the organization, as Anna says, and not just finding the data, but also over a length of time, getting that sort of cultural buy-in. I think this is important, and it's something we need to do from a business perspective, because, you know, we're a customer business, and we're very focused on our customers, and in the end, it's important to our customers, so it's important to us, but it's also important to, you know, society, and that's important as well from our purpose perspective. So getting buy-in culturally that scope 1, 2, and 3 are all critical to your business performance and future is also very important.
Yeah, just quickly from my end, I just want to quickly answer a question about setting multiple targets, and that is acceptable. You can set multiple emissions reduction targets or engagement targets that collectively reach the 2/3 threshold. And I think my tip is really for everyone to read through our resources online, and I pasted a link for the target step-by-step process to set targets, and under the develop a target tab, there are the key resources that I think would be really helpful to that will answer a lot of the questions in the Q&A panel. So yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much. So yeah, thank you, Chandan, thank you, Anna, thank you, Rowan. I think that was excellent, lots of information there. I'm so sorry we didn't get to go through all of the questions, but I think we'll try to follow up with some of them in an email. We'll also send you the recording of this through an email. But if you do have any further questions, please do just get in touch with us. So thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for joining, and thank you to our speakers, and I'll see you all soon.